That's right.
Pens versus guns.
Writers challenging colonialism.
We surrendered to the white people and were told to go home and live our usual lives and attend to our crops. But the white men sent native police who did abominable things. They assaulted our people and helped themselves to our cattle and goats. They treated us like slaves. They interfered with our wives and daughters and molested them. There was much bitterness because many of our cattle were branded and taken from us. We had no property, nothing we could call our own. We said, it is no good living under such conditions. Death would be better. Let us fight. I fought in the rebellion. I had a gun, a breech loader. They, the white men, fought us with big guns and Maxims and rifles. Many of our people were killed in the fight. One of my cousins was shot in the jaw, and the whole of his face was shot away, like this, and he died. Then Mr. Rhodes came, and we agreed at last to terms of peace. Many people had been killed. Now we began to die of starvation, and then came the rinderpest, and the cattle that was still left to us perished. We could not help thinking that these dreadful things were brought by the white people.
A. Ndansi Kumalo, describing the defeat of the Indabele in 1893.
In 1890, Cecil John Rhodes' British South Africa Company began its occupation and colonisation of what is now Zimbabwe and Zambia, which is named after him, Rhodesia.
One of the fiercest critics of British imperialism was Olive Schreiner. In her 1897 novel, Trooper Peter Halkett of Mashonaland, Olive Schreiner describes one man's crisis of conscience at the brutality inflicted in the search for wealth and land.
Trooper Peter Halkett was very weary.
He had eaten nothing all day and had touched little of the contents of a small flask of Cape brandy he carried in his breast pocket, not knowing when it would again be replenished.
As night drew near, he determined to make his resting place at the top of one of the koppies. He could not easily be approached there without his knowing it. He had not much fear of the natives. Their kraals had been destroyed and their granaries burnt for 30 miles round, and they themselves had fled. But he feared somewhat the lions, which he had never seen, and he feared vaguely he hardly knew what, when he looked forward to his first long night alone on the veldt.
Then Trooper Peter Halkett fell to thinking. He sat as one turned into stone, staring into the fire.
All men made money when they came to South Africa. Barney Bonato, Rhodes, they all made money out of the country. 8 millions, 40 millions. Why should not he?
Peter Halkett started suddenly and listened, but it was only the wind coming up the koppie like a great wheezy beast creeping upwards, and he looked back into the fire.
He considered his business prospects. When he had served his time as volunteer, he would have a large piece of land given to him, and the Mashonas and the Matabeles would have all their land taken away from them in time, and the chartered company would pass a law that they had to work for the white men, and he, Peter Halkett, would make them work for him. He would make money. Now, as he looked into the crackling blaze, it seemed to be one of the fires they'd made to burn the natives' kraals, their natives' grain, and they were throwing it all in, all that they could not carry then. Then he saw the skull of an old Mashona blown off at the top, the hands still moving. He heard the loud cry of the native women and children as they turned the Maxims onto the kraal. He was working a Maxim gun, but it seemed to him it was more like the reaping machine he had used in England, and that what was going down before it was not yellow corn, but black men's heads. And he thought when he looked back, they lay behind him in rows, like the corn in sheaves.
Later that night, alone on the koppie, Peter Halkett is visited by a Christ-like figure with whom he talks at length. He undergoes a spiritual revelation.
A curious warmth and gladness stole over Peter Halkett. He saw nothing about him but a soft, bright light. Yet in it, he heard a voice cry,
"Because thou hast loved mercy and hated oppression."
The next morning, a local man is captured. He is deemed to be a Shona spy and sentenced to be shot. When Peter Halkett tries to intercede on the prisoner's behalf, he is ordered to be the one who must execute the man at dawn.
At 10 o'clock that night, all the camp was asleep, excepting the two men told off to keep guard, who stood chatting by a large fire, which still burnt at one end. In the captain's tent, a light was kept burning all night, which shone through the thin canvas sides and shed light on the ground about. But for the rest, the camp was very still. By 1:30, the moon had gone down, and there was only a blaze of stars in the great African sky.
Then Peter Halkett rose up. Softly he lifted the canvas and crept out. Softly he followed the little footpath that the men had trodden, going down to the river for water. It led straight up to the captain's tent and the little flat-topped tree with its white stem and its two gnarled branches spread out on either side. A dead stillness was over the rest of the camp. For a moment, Peter Halkett stood motionless. Then he walked up to the tree.
The black man hung against the white stem, so closely bound to it that they seemed one. His hands were tied to his sides, and his head drooped on his breast. His eyes were closed, and his limbs, which had once been those of a powerful man, had fallen away, making the joints stand out. The hair on his head was wild and thick with neglect, and stood out roughly in long strands, and his skin was rough with want and exposure. The reeds had cut a little into his ankles, and a small flow of blood had made the ground below his feet dark. Peter Halkett
looked up at him. The man seemed dead. He touched him softly on the arm, then shook it slightly.
The man opened his eyes slowly, without raising his head, and looked at Peter from under his weary eyebrows. Except that they moved, they might have been the eyes of a dead thing.
Peter put his fingers to his own lips. Shh, shh, he said.
The man hung torpid, still looking at Peter.
Quickly, Peter Halkett knelt down and took the knife from his belt. In an instant, the reams that held the feet were cut through. In another, he cut the reams from the waist and neck. The reams dropped to the ground from the arms, and the man stood free.
Like a dazed, dumb creature, he stood with his head still down, eyeing Peter.
Aritsamaya, Hamba, look, go, whispered Peter Halkett, using a word from each African language he knew.
But the black man still stood motionless, looking up at him as one paralyzed.
Hamba, Suka, go, he whispered, motioning with his hand.
In an instant, a gleam of intelligence shot across the face, then a wild transport. Without a word, without a sound, as a tiger leaps when the wild dogs are on it, with one long, smooth spring, as though unwounded and unhurt, he turned and disappeared into the grass. It closed behind him, but as he went, the twigs and leaves cracked under his tread.
The captain threw back the door of his tent.
Who is there? He cried.
Peter Halkett stood below the tree with a knife in his hand.
The noise roused the whole camp. The men on guard came running. Guns were fired, and the half-speaking men came rushing, grasping their weapons. There was a sound of firing at the little tree, and the cry went up round the camp, "The Mashonas are releasing the spy!"
When the men got to the captain's tent, they saw that the prisoner had gone, and Peter Halkett was lying on his face at the foot of the tree, with his head turned towards the captain's door.
2 years later, Joseph Conrad's 1899 novel, Heart of Darkness, was published. Conrad reveals the atrocities being committed against native people by Europeans in the extraction of wealth.
The so-called Congo Free State was the private colony of King Leopold II of Belgium.
His personal private enterprise for the extraction by trade, theft, or forced labour of ivory and later on rubber.
Troops would surround a village. Women and children were locked up, and until the men came back with the right quantity of ivory or rubber sap. One punishment for insufficient collection was amputation of the hands or feet of the women and children.
10 million Congolese died. Conrad's protagonist Marlowe bears witness to these horrors. Shortly after Marlowe arrives in the Congo, he comes across a group of Congolese forced labourers building a railway line.
A slight clinking behind me made me turn my head. 6 black men advanced in a file, toiling up the path. They walked erect and slow, balancing small baskets of earth on their heads, and the clink kept time with their footsteps. Black rags were wound round their loins, and the short ends behind wagged to and fro like tails. I could see every rib. The joints of their limbs were like knots in a rope. Each had an iron collar on his neck, and all were connected together with a chain whose bites swung between them, rhythmically clinking. Another report from the cliff made me think suddenly of that ship of war I had seen firing into a continent. It was the same kind of ominous voice, but these men could by no stretch of imagination be called enemies. They were called criminals, and the outraged law, like a bursting shell, had come to them, an insoluble mystery from over the sea.
Marlowe finds another work gang of forced labourers who are dying of exhaustion and starvation.
Black shapes crouched, lay, sat between the trees, leaning against the trunks, in all the attitudes of pain, abandonment, and despair. They were dying slowly, it was very clear. They were not enemies, they were not criminals. They were nothing earthly now, nothing but black shadows of disease and starvation lying confusedly in the greenish gloom. While I stood horror-struck, one of these creatures rose to his hands and knees and went off on all fours towards the river to drink.
But Conrad's main purpose is to show the moral corruption and degradation of the Europeans running the show, who are there only to bag as much ivory as they can. Marlowe explains.
I saw this station, these men strolling aimlessly around in the sunshine of the yard. I asked myself sometimes what it all meant. They wandered here and there with their absurd long staves in their hands, like a lot of faithless pilgrims bewitched inside a rotten fence. The word ivory rang in the air, was whispered, was sighed. You would think they were praying to it. A taint of imbecile rapacity blew through it all, like a whiff from some corpse. By Jove, I've never seen anything so unreal in my life. And outside the silent green wilderness surrounding this cleared speck of the earth struck me as something great and invincible, like evil or truth, waiting patiently for the passing away of this fantastic invasion.
This devoted band called itself the El Dorado Exploring Expedition, and I believe they were sworn to secrecy. Their talk, however, was the talk of sordid buccaneers. It was reckless without hardihood, greedy without audacity, cruel without courage. There was not an atom of foresight or of serious intention in the whole batch of them, and they did not seem aware that these things were wanted for the work of the world. To tear treasure out of the bowels of the land was their desire, with no more moral purpose at the back of it than there is in burglars breaking into a safe.
But Marlowe's greatest shock was to discover the moral quagmire into which Mr. Kurtz had sunk. This explorer who had come to the Congo with high ideals of service had turned into the most venal, corrupt, and greedy of all.
Ivory? I should think so. Heaps of it, stacks of it. The old mud shanty was bursting with it. You would think there was not a single tusk left, either above or below the ground, in the whole country. Mostly fossil, the manager had remarked disparagingly. There was no more fossil than I am, but they call it fossil when it is dug up. It appears these villagers do bury the tusks sometimes, but evidently they couldn't bury this parcel deep enough to save the gifted Mr. Kurtz from his fate. We filled the steamboat with it and had to pile a lot on the deck. Thus he could see and enjoy as long as he could, because the appreciation of this favour had remained with him to the last. You should have heard him say, "My ivory." Oh yes, I heard him. My intendant, my ivory, my station, my river, everything belonged to him. It made me hold my breath in expectation of hearing the wilderness burst into a prodigious peal of laughter that would shake the thick stars in their places.
Marlowe does not blame the Belgians alone for the rape of the Congo. Kurtz's mother was half English, and his father half French. All Europe contributed to the making of Kurtz. And by I learned that most appropriately, the International Society for the Suppression of Savage Customs had entrusted him with the making of a report for its future guidance.
Marlowe meets the young Russian follower of Kurtz, who explains it was dangerous to inquire too much, but mostly his expeditions had been for ivory.
But he had no goods to trade with by that time, I objected.
There's a lot of good cartridges left, even yet, he answered, looking away.
To speak plainly, he raided the country, I said.
He nodded.
Not alone, surely.
He muttered something about the villagers around the lake.
Kurtz got the tribe to follow him, did he?
When they reached Kurtz's house far up the river, Marlowe staggered to find it surrounded by stakes with human heads on them. All the heads except one were looking towards the house.
There it was, black, dried, sunken, with closed eyelids. A head that seemed to sleep at the top of that pole, and with a shrunken, dry lips showing a narrow white line of the teeth, like a smile. The young Russian defends Kurtz.
I had no idea of the conditions, he said. These heads, they were the heads of rebels.
I shocked him excessively by laughing. Rebels! What would be the next definition I was to hear? There'd been enemies, criminals, workers, and these were rebels.
Kurtz has also formed a sexual union with a Congolese woman. Marlowe describes her. She walked with measured steps, draped in striped and fringed cloths, treading the earth proudly with a slight jingle and flash of barbarous ornaments. She carried her head high, bizarre things, charms, gifts of witchmen that hung about her, glittered and trembled at every step. She must have had the value of several elephant tusks upon her.
By 1870, the Congo was one of the last untouched reservoirs of ivory.
The lust for ivory depicted here is as old as time, but indigenous hunters did little overall damage to herd numbers.
When the white man arrived with guns, the devastation began. By the 1870s, a kind of gold rush for ivory was underway. In 1878 alone, 220,000 pianos with ivory keys were made in the United States. 170,000 elephants were killed that year in Africa. One hunter in northern Namibia bagged 3,000. In the year 1600, there were elephants in the Cape Peninsula. San art in the Karoo depicts elephants. But by 1900, there were fewer than 6,000 elephants south of the Zambezi.
In the early 1900s, the Congo Reform Committee praised Harvey Darkness as the most powerful thing ever written on the subject of the Congo atrocities, highly influential in bringing them to the world's attention and contributing to their reform.
These two novels depict two different kinds of colonialism.
Congo and many parts of West Africa experienced extractive colonialism. India and most Asian colonies were more extractive rather than settler colonies. The colonials who came might stay 20 years, but they didn't leave the home country forever, though they still imposed their religion, education, law, and culture.
Southern Africa experienced settler colonialism from the 1600s, and then spreading north and east right up through Africa. Ireland, Australia, New Zealand, and North America all experienced British settler colonization.
Settler colonials had the dream of the empty land just waiting for them to arrive.
Of course, it never has existed, but this fantasy is reflected in their literature. J.M. Coetzee, in White Writing, refers to the dream topography in which Africa is construed as a vast, empty, silent space. In the Place Roman and other early South African literature, with black labour generally absent from the narrative.
Early 20th century South African painting illustrated the same dream of an empty land. In an article in Frieze, Sean O'Toole refers to a letter to a Durban newspaper in 1925, written by novelist and poet William Plumer, who pointed to an omission in the ecstatic landscapes being produced by white painters such as Pierre Folchet and Peter Venning.
We are in danger of too many felt yearnings, too much Karoo urge, too frequent sunsets on the Drakensberg and moon risings on Groot Constantia. A little less landscape and a little more portraiture would be highly stimulating.
While artists may have seen the beauty and majesty of the landscape, the mercantile eye saw only profit, and across the colonies forests were devastated and not replaced. Famous English novelist Anthony Trollope toured South Africa in 1877. In his travel diary, he notes,
Cutting timber is a good, wholesome employment, and if the market be bad today, it will probably be good tomorrow. And even Dutch woodcutters will become civilized when the schoolmaster gradually makes his own money. But I did express myself as disappointed when I was told that nothing was ever done to restore the forests as the hillsides are laid bare by the axe. There will be an end to the wood, even on the spurs of the Otaniqua range, if no care be taken to assist the reproduction of nature. The government of the Cape Colony should look to this, as do the Swiss cantons and the German duchies.
When the colonials take the land, the native population has few options. They can move out of the way if they want, they can stay and become workers for the settlers, or they can resist and fight back. But fighting back, it does not usually succeed when the odds are so heavily against you. Some people, like the San people of South Africa, the Native Americans, the Native Tasmanians, the Caribs and other Caribbean people, and the Aborigines in Australia largely perished, along with their languages and culture. Anthony Trollope noted what he saw as differences among the various British colonies.
South Africa is a country of black men and not of white men. It has been so, it is so, and it will continue to be so. In this respect, it is altogether unlike Australia, unlike the Canadas, and unlike New Zealand. And as it is unlike them, so should it be to us a matter of much purer gratification than are these successful colonies.
There we have gone, with our ploughs and with our brandy, with all the good and all the evil which our civilization has produced. And throughout the lands, the native races have perished by their contact with us.
In Australia, we've been successful. We're clothed with its wools. Our coffers are filled with its gold. Our brothers and our children are living there in bounteous plenty.
But during the century that we have been there, we have caused the entire population of a whole continent to perish. It is impossible to think of such prosperity without a dash of suffering, without a pang of remorse.
In her 1946 poem, Bora Ring, Australian poet Judith Wright laments the disappearance of Aboriginal culture.
The song is gone. The dance is secret with the dancers in the earth, the ritual useless, and the tribal story lost in an alien tale.
Only the grass stands up to mark the dancing ring. The applegum's posture and mine a past corollary murmur a broken chant.
The hunter is gone, the spear is splintered underground, the painted bodies a dream the world grieved, sleeping and forgot. The nomad feet are still.
In South Africa, one of the most exceptional examples of writers bearing witness is to be found in the works of Charles Bleek and Lucy Lloyd, who collected thousands of pages of testimony from San prisoners at the Cape and created a dictionary of their language. In a letter, Lucy Lloyd describes,
"What I learned from Bushmen who lived with us in Mowbray with regard to the treatment received by them from the generality of farmers. For instance, their water picks were taken from them, although they had belonged to certain Bushman families for generations, that the game had been driven from their hunting grounds, that the ostrich, whom they seemed to look upon as a possession, and to kill with a certain consideration, and whose eggs and death contributed to their maintenance, were chased to death by the farmers on horseback in the hot sun, and left dead and wasting on the hot ground.
as the game was slaughtered and the land fenced, the people started to starve.
To fend off starvation, the clan stole cattle or sheep from the farmers, who then got commanders together to hunt and kill them. Diacre describes to Lucy Lloyd how the morning mist comes to their assistance.
At the time when the people have come near to attack us, it is morning. The mist sits there, our mist. They shoot at us in the mist. When the people went away, the mist also went, while we felt that our blood had flowed out.
In a passage from Ollie Schreiner's The Story of an African Farm, published in 1883, the imagination of the boy Waldo is fired by the ancient fossils and sand paintings he discovers in the Karoo Rock. Waldo interprets the paintings to the two girls, Lyndall and Anne.
It seems that the stones are really speaking of the old things, of the time when the strange fishes and animals lived that are now turned to stone, and the lakes were here. And then of the time when the little bushmen lived here, so small and so ugly, and used to sleep in the wild dog holes and in the sloots, and eat snakes and shoot the bucks with their poisoned arrows. It was one of them, one of these old wild bushmen that painted those.
Said the boy, nodding towards the pictures.
One who was different from the rest. He did not know why, but he wanted to make something beautiful. He wanted to make something, so he made these. He worked hard, very hard, to find the juice to make the paint. And then he found this place where the rocks hang over, and he painted them. To us, they're only strange things that make us laugh, but to him, they were very beautiful.
In South Africa, the majority of the native inhabitants were not exterminated. The Xhosa, Zulu, Tswana, and other Nguni people put up a tremendous fight against European colonization. But at the same time, they engaged with the settlers, contributing to every possible economic activity with their labour. As Anthony Trollope remarks,
the work is done by black men. They plough, they reap, they herd and shear the sheep. They drive the oxen, they load the wagons, they carry the bricks, they draw the water, they hew the wood. They brush the clothes, they clean the boots, they run the posts, they make the roads, they wait at table, they cook the food, they wash the wool, they press the grapes, they kill the beef and mutton. They dig the gardens, they plaster the walls, they feed the horses, and they find the diamonds.
In some colonies where indigenous populations had died or declined to work for the white man, the settlers opted to import people as slaves. This was the case in the early Cape Colony.
In most of the Americas, North, South, and the Caribbean, settlers needed labour for their plantations and chose African slave labour to provide it. So the Atlantic slave trade began.
By the 1600s, European settlers in the West Indies were establishing sugar plantations. Sugar was a new taste, popular with the new drink from the East, tea.
England wanted a slice of the pie. So in 1660, King Charles II and some London merchants chartered the Royal African Company to trade on the West African coast. The commodity was human beings who were traded as slaves to labour on the sugar plantations.
In 400 years of the transatlantic slave trade, over 12 million captives were shipped to the Americas. Nearly 2 million died en route.
Olade Equiano was an Igbo boy, aged 11, when he was kidnapped by African slave traders and sold to English slave traders in about 1755.
He describes the appalling conditions in the hold of the slave ship.
The closeness of the place and the heat, added to the number in the ship, which was so crowded that each had scarcely room to turn himself, almost suffocated us. A variety of loathsome smells brought on sickness among the slaves, of which many died. This wretched situation was aggravated by the galling of the chains and the filth of the necessary tubs, into which the children often fell and were almost suffocated, amid the shrieks of the women and the groans of the dying.
Years later, he managed to buy his freedom. Thereafter, he lived in England and campaigned for the abolition of the slave trade. In 1789, he published his memoirs, The Interesting Narrative of the Life of Olado Equiano. His book was a publishing success and made an important contribution to the gathering argument for the abolition of this evil trade.
The British prohibited the slave trade in 1807. Slavery itself was abolished throughout the British Empire in 1834.
Thereafter, the practice of slavery in certain parts of Africa became a pretext for the expansion of colonialism. The Ashanti, in what is today Ghana, practiced slavery. They resisted the British for years. Lord Baden-Powell, the colonel in the Fourth Ashanti War, wrote an account of their eventual defeat in 1896.
Fetish superstition has an immense hold on the untutored children of the bush, and human sacrifice is considered the best form of propitiation of the fetish demons. As a rule, the victims of the fetish sacrifice were slaves. The suppression of this abuse has been one result of the expedition. In accordance with orders, we set the whole of the fetish village in flames, and a splendid blaze it made. The great fetish tree, in whose shade hundreds of victims had been sacrificed, was blown up with gun cotton.
The king of the Ashanti, Prempeh, is made to
render submission to the British officers in accordance with the native form and custom signifying abject surrender. With bad enough grace, he, Prempeh, walked from his chair, accompanied by the Queen Mother, and bowing before Mr. Maxwell, he embraced his knees. It was a little thing, but it was a blow to the Ashanti pride and prestige, such as they had never suffered before. Then came the demand for payment of indemnity for the war. The king could produce only a 20th part of what had been promised. Accordingly, he was told that he and his mother-in-law would now be held as prisoners and deported to the Gold Coast. The sentence moved the Ashantis very visibly, his ministers on their feet clamouring for delay and reconsideration. The only man among them was the Queen. In vain. Prempeh was taken in charge by Inspector Donovan. The arrest was complete.
Baden-Powell then attends to the pillage of the palace.
There could be no more interesting, no more tempting work than this. To poke around in a barbarian king's palace whose wealth has been reported very great. The work of collecting the treasure was entrusted to a group of British soldiers, and it was done most honestly and well, without a single case of looting. Here was a man with an armful of gold-hilted swords, there one with a box full of gold trinkets and rings, another with a spirit case full of bottles of brandy. Yet in no instance was there any attempt at looting.
Happily, the results of no looting can still be viewed in the British Museum. Baden-Powell also concedes another benefit to bringing the area under British control.
The extension of our boundaries till they touch the Niger will save the Gold Coast from being shut out from up-country trade by a junction of two French forces in Dahomey and Timbuktu. Our friends across the channel are just beginning to suspect that using Prempeh as a nail to hang our cloak on, we have quietly beaten them in the race for the Gold Coast hinterland.
Stories of human sacrifice and cannibalism fed popular British belief in white racial superiority and the British as saviours of savages. Let us explore R.M. Ballantyne's 1857 adventure novel for boys, The Coral Island.
3 English boys, Ralph, Jack and Peterkin, are stranded on a Pacific island.
They do an absolutely aesthetic job of survival, maintaining civilised British standards.
Ralph is caught by pirates, one of whom, Bill, shows him the savages.
A native lad advanced to the edge of the pond and gave a low, peculiar whistle. The water churned, an enormous eel thrust its head above the surface and allowed the youth to touch it. It was about 12 feet long and as thick round the body as a man's thigh.
There, said Bill, his lip curling with contempt. What do you think of that for a god, Ralph? This is one of their gods, and it has been fed with dozens of living babies already.
Babies?
Aye, babies, I've seen it with my own eyes. They don't feed it regular with living babies, but they give it one now and again as a treat. Bah, you brute, said Bill in disgust, giving the reptile a kick on the snout with his heavy boot that sent it sweltering back in agony into its loathsome pool.
How comes does it, Bill, that the mothers allow such a dreadful thing to be done?
Allow it? The mothers do it. There's nothing too fiendish or diabolical for these people to do. One of their customs is to murder their infants the moment they're born. The mothers agree to it, and the fathers do it. And the mildest way of murdering them is by sticking them through the body with sharp splinters of bamboo.
Have these wretched creatures no law among themselves that would prevent such wickedness?
None. The chief's word is law. He might kill and eat a dozen of his subjects any day just for his own pleasure, and nobody would take the least notice of it.
In The Descent of Man, published in 1871, Charles Darwin explored the hypothesis of different human races and concluded it was false. There is only one human race.
But he still divided humanity into civilized and savage.
Writers of popular fiction disseminated this idea, like the civilized white boys and the savages in the Coral Island.
White Europeans living in the colonized tropics were thought to be in danger of moral corruption and even insanity from a sultry climate and the proximity of debauched savages. As in Charlotte Bronte's Jane Eyre, where Mr. Rochester's Jamaican Creole wife is a violent madwoman locked in his attic.
In the deep shade at the far end of the room, a figure ran backwards and forwards. What it was, whether beast or human being, one could not tell. It grovelled on all four. It snatched and growled like some strange, wild animal. But it was covered with clothing, and a quantity of dark, grizzled hair, wild as a mane, hid its head and face.
Good morrow, Mrs. Poole, said Mr. Rochester. How are you? And how is your charge today?
Oh, we're tolerable, sir, I thank you.
A fierce cry gave the lie to her report. The clothed hyena rose up and stood tall on its hind feet.
Ah, sir, she sees you.
The lunatic sprang and grappled his throat viciously. More than once she almost throttled him.
At last he mastered her arms. Mrs. Poole gave him a cord and he bound her to a chair. The operation was performed amidst the fiercest yells and most convulsive plunges. Mr. Rochester then turned to us with a smile both acrid and desolate.
That is my wife.
He explains to Jane Eyre.
I lived with that woman upstairs for 4 years. Her vices sprang up thick and fast. What a pygmy intellect she had, and what giant appetites. A wife at once intemperate and unchaste.
By the end of the 19th century, the British Empire and all these attitudes stretched around the world. The other imperial powers, France, Russia, Germany, vied with Britain for territory. They swelled with a new nationalist pride. Indian poet and philosopher Rabindranath Tagore warned of the dangers of nationalism in his poem, The Sunset of the Century, written on December the 31st, 1899.
The last sun of the century sets amidst the blood-red clouds of the west and the whirlwind of hatred.
The naked passion of the self-love of nations in its drunken delirium of greed is dancing to the clash of steel and howling verses of vengeance.
The hungry self of the nation shall burst in a violence of fury from its shameless feeding.
For it has made the world its food.
And licking it, crunching it, and swallowing it in big morsels.
It swells and it swells.
In 1914, the imperial nations went to war. France, Russia, and Britain against Germany, Austro-Hungary, and the Ottoman Empire. The first ever world war.
Millions of colonial subject peoples were drafted into their armies. Millions would die.
But from the start of the 20th century, colonized people across the empires also started to feel the emotional force of nationalism, yearning to throw off the colonial yoke.
Starting with Ireland.
In 1541, English King Henry VIII had declared himself King of Ireland. Thereafter, almost all the good land was taken by English settlers, who considered the Celtic Irish to be racially inferior.
In terrible famines in the 19th century, 1 million people died, thousands of Irish emigrated. Many went to England.
Victorian philosopher Thomas Carlyle commented,
Unfortunately, they speak a partially intelligible dialect of the English tongue, and having a white skin and European features cannot be prevented from circulating among us at discretion.
Robert Knox, the infamous ethnologist, declared, "The Irish are at once white, but not quite white, and certainly not fit to self-govern."
Despite all this, hundreds of thousands of Irish men and women served loyally in World War I.
But Irish nationalism was growing. In April 1916, the Irish Republican Army in Dublin gambled on British attention being focused on Germany and launched a rebellion, the Easter Rising.
The British crushed the rebellion and tried the leaders for treason. 16 were executed.
In his poem, Easter 1916, W.B. Yeats proclaimed,
I write it out in a verse. MacDonagh and McBride and Connolly and Pearse, now and in time to be, wherever the green is worn, are changed utterly. A terrible beauty is born.
In 16 Dead Men, he wrote,
Oh, but we talked at large before the 16 men were shot. But who can talk of give and take, what should be and what not, while those dead men are loitering there to stir the boiling pot? You say that we should still allow until Germany's overcome, but who is there to argue that? Now Pearse is deaf and dumb, and is there logic to outweigh MacDonagh's bony thumb?
The Irish poet George Russell, who was sceptical about the Easter Rising, was swept up by the martyrdom of the 16.
Into the memory of some I knew who are dead and loved Ireland, he wrote,
Their dream had left me numb and cold, but yet my spirit rose in pride, refashioning in burnished gold the images of those who died or were shut in the penal cell. Here's to you, Pearse, your dream, not mine, but yet the thought for which you fell has turned life's water into wine.
As the First World War ended, the Irish War of Independence began. The Irish Republican Army, or IRA, burnt down many of the great houses of the English colonial settlers. In her novel, The Last September, set in 1920, Elizabeth Bowen describes the life of a settler family, on of tennis parties and dinners as they tried to ignore the rising conflict around them.
The novel ends with the torching of their mansion, Daniel's Tower, by the IRA.
For, in February, the execution rather, of 3 great houses occurred in the same night.
A fearful scarlet ate up the hard spring darkness. It seemed, looking from east to west, at the sky, tall with scarlet, that the country itself was burning.
At Danielstown, halfway up the avenue under the beeches, the thin iron gate twanged, missed its latch, remained swinging aghast as the last unlit car slid out with the executioner's bland from accomplished duty.
Then the first wave of a silence that was to be ultimate flowed back confidently to the steps. The door stood open hospitably upon a furnace.
Sir Richard and Lady Naylor, not saying anything, did not look at each other, for in the light from the sky they saw too distinctly.
The British brought in a new force of temporary constables, the Black and
They
Tans.
terrorised the population,
They carried out reprisals against family members of IRA fighters,
torturing of homes,
rape of women.
torture of suspects.
The IRA used similar tactics against people who collaborated with the army or the Black and
The
Tans.
people were caught in the middle.
Songwriter Dominic Beard responded in angry song.
Oh, come out, you black and tans. Oh, come out, you black and tans, come out and fight me like a man. Show your wives how you won medals down in Flanders. Show us how the IRA made you run like hell away from the deep and lovely lakes of Kilishandra.
Come, let us hear you tell how you slandered great Parnell when you thought him well and truly persecuted. Where are the sneers and jeers that you loudly let us hear when your leaders of 60 were executed.
Oh, come out, you British Huns, come out and fight without your guns. Show your whites so you won medals up in Derry. You murdered 16 men and you'll do the same again. So get out of here and take your bloody army.
Come out, you black and tans, come out and fight me like a man. Show your wife how you won medals down in Flanders. Tell her how the IRA made you run like hell away from the green and lovely lanes of Killishandra.
But the 1923 play, The Shadow of the Gunman by Sean Casey, questions false heroism.
It's the civilians that suffer. When there's an ambush, they don't know where to run. Shot in the back to save the British Empire, and shot in the breast to save the soul of Ireland. I'm a nationalist myself, right enough. I believe in the freedom of Ireland, and that England has no right to be here. But I draw the line when I hear the gunmen blowing about dying for the people, when it's the people that are dying for the gunmen.
The Catholic majority were fighting for independence from Britain. The Protestant minority utterly refused the idea. To resolve the deadlock, the Irish negotiators agreed to the partition of Ireland.
In December 1922, the Irish Free State was granted independence.
But without 6 Protestant majority counties in the north, which remained part of the United Kingdom.
Civil war broke out and raged for 11 months.
The Sniper by Liam Flaherty shows the horror of civil war when families fight on different sides.
The Republican sniper smiled and lifted his revolver above the edge of the parapet. Pressing his lips together, he took a deep breath and fired. He was almost deafened with the report.
Then, when the smoke cleared, he peered across and uttered a cry of joy. His enemy on the roof had been hit. He was reeling over the parapet in his death agony. Then he fell forward. The body turned over and over its face and hit the ground with a dull thud. Then it lay still.
The sniper felt a sudden curiosity. He darted across the street. A machine gun tore up the ground around him with a hail of bullets, but he escaped. He threw himself downward beside the corpse. The machine gun stopped. Then the sniper turned over the dead body
and looked into his own brother's face.
India was the jewel in the crown of the British Empire, with a population of 274 million in 1901. In 1921, Mahatma Gandhi became leader of the Indian National Congress in its campaign for Swaraj, or Home Rule.
The British in India continued to hold polo tournaments and horse races and live elegant lives with many servants.
Some did arrive with ideas of equality with the Indians, but they were quickly disabused by their colleagues.
E.M. Forster's A Passage to India, published in 1924, satirises the British colonials. He suggests that 12 months is long enough to corrupt any Englishman in India and turn him into a racist caricature.
English women are given only 6 months.
Shortly after the elderly Mrs. Moore arrives in India, she unexpectedly encounters Dr. Aziz in a deserted mosque at night.
An Englishwoman stepped out into the moonlight. Dr. Aziz was furiously angry and shouted, "Madam, madam, madam!
Oh!
Madam, this is a mosque. You have no right to be here. You should have taken off your shoes. This is a holy place for Muslims."
But I have taken them off.
You have?
Yes, I left them at the entrance.
Then I beg your pardon.
Yes, I was right, was I not? If I have taken them off, I am allowed.
Of course. But so few ladies take the trouble, especially if thinking no one is here to see.
But that makes no difference. God is here.
God is here. Very good. Very fine indeed. I think you are newly arrived in India.
Later in the novel, Adela Quested falsely accuses Dr. Aziz of attempted rape a visit to the Malabar Caves.
The accusations detonates the paranoia among the white men that their white women are in danger of falling victim to the lascivious desires of the native men, a fear that played out in many colonial settings. In the club that evening,
They'd started speaking of women and children, that phrase that exempts a male from sanity that has been repeated a few times. Each felt that all he loved best in the world was at stake and demanded revenge. But it's the women and children, they repeated.
at Dr. Aziz's trial for attempted rape, Adela suddenly declares that she has made a mistake.
Dr. Aziz is set free, but he cannot retrieve his life as a respected doctor in Chandrapur. He will not forget English. He gets a job in one of the princely states.
In the final scene, he goes horse riding with Fielding, the only English friend who stood by him in his ordeal.
And Aziz, in an awful rage, danced this way and that in the saddle, not knowing what to do, and he cried,
"Down with the English anyhow, that's certain. Clear out, you fellows, double quick, I say. We may hate one another, but we hate you most. Yes, we shall drive every blasted Englishman into the sea, and then,
he rode against him furiously,
and then,
he concluded, half kissing him.
you and I shall be friends."
During the next decade, the wheels of political reform began to turn at some speed, but British colonial life changed little.
Burma was administered as part of India. In 1934, George Orwell published Burmese Days, a novel based on his experiences in the British Imperial Police in northern Burma, in which he goes further than E.M. Forster in satirising British colonials.
When the commissioner suggests it would show diplomacy to admit one Oriental to the club, timber merchant Mr. Ellis fumes.
He's asking us to break all our rules and take a dear little Oriental into this club. Dear Dr. Veeraswamy, for instance. Dr. Very Slimy, I call him.
As they gather in the club for pre-breakfast drinks. The room was stifling hot. Everyone's shirt stuck to his back in the first sweat of the day. The invisible chokra, who pulled the punka rope outside, was falling asleep in the glare.
"Butler!" yelled Ellis. "The fan stopped. Go and wake that bloody chokra up.
Yes, master.
And Butler,
Yes, master.
how much ice have we got left?"
About £20, master. Will only last a day, I think. I find it very difficult to keep the ice cool now.
"Don't talk like that, damn you! I find it very difficult. You swallowed a dictionary? Master, please can't keeping ice cool. That's how you ought to talk. We shall have to sack this fellow if he talks English too well. Do you hear, Butler?"
Yes, master.
Other club members, like Mr. Lackerstein, are more interested in booze and sex with the local women.
His wife governed him by never letting him out of her sight.
Only once, a year after they were married, she had left him for a fortnight and returned unexpectedly a day early to find Mr. Lackerstein drunk, supported on either side by a naked Burmese girl, while a third upended a whiskey bottle into his mouth.
Noel Coward makes us chuckle at the eccentric English colonial in his 1931 song, Mad Dogs and Englishmen.
"Mad dogs and Englishmen go out in the midday sun."
The Japanese don't care to, the Chinese wouldn't dare to. Hindus and Argentines sleep firmly from 12 to 1. But Englishmen detest a siesta. In the Philippines there are lovely screens to protect you from the glare. In the Malay states there are hats like plates which the Britishers won't wear. At 12 noon the natives swoon and know for the work is done. But
Mad dogs and Englishmen go out in the midday sun. Mad dogs and Englishmen go out in the midday sun. The toughest Burmese bandit can never understand it. In Rangoon, the heat of noon is just what the natives shun. They put their scotch or rye down and lie down. In a jungle town where the sun beats down to the rage of man and beast, the English guard of the English South merely gets a bit more creased. In Bangkok at 12 o'clock they foam at the mouth and run, but mad dogs and Englishmen go out in the midday, out in the midday, out in the midday sun.